you very much for inviting me here. Thank you for the introduction. Quickly, so I'm born in New York. I started playing drums at age 9. That's just what appealed to me out of all the other instruments. And I think it appealed to my hyperactivity as well. And I grew up, left school, and in the vibrant New York music scene, I discovered Arabic music, which spoke to me very, very, very deeply. Ooh. And I knew that I had to pursue Arabic music and Arab culture and Arab language. I spent years cultivating that, and I ended up starting a nonprofit called the New York Arabic Orchestra, where other Americans got the opportunity to also live and breathe Arabic music. Alongside this, I was getting my master's in forensic psychology, which in general is psychology as it applies to social situations, social settings, from prisons and psychiatric units to refugee camps and other communities. It's a community-based psychology, if you will. I eventually left to Lebanon for 3 years, where I pursued work with refugee youth, where we focused on teaching Arabic music and language to the youth, Palestinian and Syrian youth primarily. And I've since returned to New York 2 years ago, and am leading multiple groups in drum therapy, music therapy, in learning the drums, learning the gambus, and lecturing and performing, and also leading meditative groups in music. So now I'm here in Malaysia for this wonderful music therapy tour under the U.S. Embassy and Crescent Collective. Very grateful to be here. So I want to just start by talking about, in the modern world, what music therapy and what arts therapy means, just to give some perspective, the modern time. So arts therapies, music therapy is seen, is used in 3 ways. It's used to address anger, address what we consider releasing, which is anger and sadness. It's also used to address mania, hyperactivity, or excess energy, which we use it therefore in a calming sense. So calming, releasing, and also we use it in, as we're talking about, in the symptoms, preventing or alleviating symptoms of trauma, which we usually regard alleviation, prevention, as well as supplementing another kind of treatment, which usually could be medical or a pharmaceutical treatment. When we talk about trauma, interesting thing, trauma is considered anything from war, abuse, to moving house. We have these tiny traumas and we have these big traumas, but they all accumulate in us. So arts therapies are used, at least in a modern time, still in a sort of supplementary way to alleviate or prevent those symptoms. Now that's an overview of the modern, but it's important that we start looking at the history. Now, some of the modern uses can sort of start to tell us about the history and the mystery, interestingly that those words rhyme, of the therapy around music and arts. So for example, when a big natural disaster, let's say, happens, for example in California, and they had, let's say, a big earthquake, and there was mass death and bridges falling and people dying all over the streets, screaming, chaos, they would send an emergency psychological team to the emergency rescue team and make them describe what they experienced within 24 hours. Very important that it's within 24 hours. So what would they be describing? They would be describing the sounds, the smell, the sight, the feeling, their sense of time. You know, every bit, every moment of that story, they have to tell the story of what they experienced. Even if it's usually what's the word? It's usually not exact. For example, when you're experiencing something like that, your sense of time is distorted. But regardless, you have to speak, you have to say what you experienced, right? So why? You know, why is this? Why within 24 to 48 hours we need to talk about something like this? Now, psychology and biology, when it talks about these things, it does its best to describe what's happening in the brain. But there still is a great amount of mystery to it. Now, we could say it prevents post-traumatic stress disorder or other types of symptoms before it gets under the skin. What does that mean? We don't exactly 100% know. If I cut you open and look at your blood, I can't find your trauma. I can't find your story. I can't find your experience. There won't be a picture of that there, right? So the other mysteries about expression, about emotion, when we cry or we sweat. So I could sweat now, but I'm not running a race. I'm just sweating because I'm nervous, or my brain is working overtime, or my heart's working overtime, right? Or crying. Why does an emotion lead to water coming out of the eyes? You know, biology can do its best to explain what's happening, but there is something very mysterious about this. So we can't really discuss music therapy without first discussing really what music means and arts mean to the world. For example, before the very, very recent point in history, these past few hundred years, music and arts and were always taught in the schools. It wasn't a question. You played an instrument, you drew, you sang, you did storytelling, you did poetry. This was a foundation to the overall education. It wasn't a side dish that maybe if you want you can take. The ancients and the old teachings and the old ways knew that it's essential to us. Why? Again, how much can biology tell us? But one thing was for sure, that the arts and spirituality and health were all considered one thing. Even the disciplines of math, science at one time was more creative arts as well. You know, we're exploring a theory. It didn't necessarily have to be true. It wasn't until more the capitalist or industrial age really took over and said, science, you need to create products now. And then the different disciplines started going into their different corners. But for the majority of human history, all these disciplines were one. Now, if you've heard a little bit about Pythagoras, he was obsessed with music. And he discovered, like when he heard the hammer hitting metal, he said, oh, that has a certain echo. You know, maybe I can use music or sound to measure distances. So he went so far as to use that principle to measure the distances between the planets in the universe. Later on, they said, oh, it's not perfect, it's not exact, but in general, you know, using sound music in such a way, many of us don't think of music and sound in those terms. Now, also Pythagoras created a secret society around music. And he carried that on through the ages. Now, his music that they created a secret society around was it incorporated a lot of quarter tone scales. I don't know if there's any musicians here, but you know, the piano, for example, is fixed. You have white keys, black keys. If you will, if you picture these red keys in between the white and black keys. So there was this old music that had a microtonal system, we call it, which, for example, again, for musicians, if you have E or you have E flat, then you would also have E half flat, right? So there were more notes, and he had very basic instruments too, fretless ethnic instruments that were part of the society. Now, we know many of the great thinkers like Galileo, Newton, Pythagoras for certain things, like they contributed this to math or this to science, but all of these guys were also considered prophets. If you know, recently there was a great movie that came out about an Indian mathematician who received his proofs, like he's like, no, they're from God, I know they're right. And the British said, well, if you want to be here at this university and building your name, you need to prove that. He's like, no, but I know they're right. I know from God, I know they're right. So again, like spirituality was not this bad word that it, you know, nowadays it's again, it's like sort of sometimes placed far from this discipline or that. But once it was all mixed, you know, Newton, Galileo, Pythagoras, they were also seen as prophets. They were also artists. They were musicians. They were astrologists. They believed in the science of astrology as well, the planets, how all these things affect us. So now also, going even back further, we have the indigenous populations around the world, which very luckily we can meet many of these groups today. They've carried a lot of those traditions with them. So in every country, we have native or indigenous population that uses music and uses the arts, uses dance, movement, storytelling, in order to do very basic things like speak to God, speak to the crops, speak to making rain, speak to healing someone, healing themselves, healing the world, healing the family, creating blessings, and take it for granted, you know. The indigenous populations today, you know, like if you speak to a shaman is typically the word for a leader of these groups, would laugh at our idea of reality. You know, we think this is real. For them, the invisible world is real. You know, the speaking to the guides and the spirits and God and the plants and the animals. That's, you know, real. And for us, you know, looking at our cell phones, thinking that's the reality. Which, by the way, the interesting thing about the cell phone, which we take for granted, it actually utilizes a lot of this technology that we have naturally, you know. So, going a little bit into this science and biology, there is something that we can pull out of this, so that it's not just talk, if you will, because it's not so easy to accept this in these modern times when we're conditioned against this way of thinking that, oh, there's an invisible world we can engage with, and oh, music has this spiritual connection, you know. We're not taught this too much anymore in this time. The interesting thing, so the brain is shown to be lit up, many areas of the brain, when we're deeply asleep. When we're deeply asleep, this is called theta state, where the brain waves are at 4 beats per second or so. Now also, the same thing occurs when if you take what's called plant medicine or hallucinogen, they call it mushrooms, they call peyote or ayahuasca or LSD even, also shows the brain to be more alive. You know, to the point where, yes, you can feel the trees breathing and you can communicate more with the nature, right? Now, another way that this happens is what we call drum journeying. drum journeying. And this is where the connection to the ancient time is discussed. So this drum, these drums that we see here, are part of a family called frame drum. Frame drum, simply a frame, a round wooden frame with usually a skin, an animal skin head that was sacrificed for the drum. Now, this was, and still is, a ceremony even to create the drum, because we know how important it is. We know that each sound has a meaning, has conversation, has relevance to speaking with the invisible world. Every single note, and the wood and the trees and the animals that gave its life essentially to create that. The tradition of shamanism, which is considered the sort of the oldest spiritual tradition of human beings, is traced back maybe 100,000 years. And so is this drum. This drum was the tool to that communication. Every part of the world has its own version of it. For example, Malaysia has Marawas has the Marawas. And it's just simply, in terms of the local musics, maybe played a little differently, but overall it's the same idea, it's the same structure. We have in Ireland, we have the Arab world, we have in Africa and Latin America. But the tradition is there. And the interesting thing, so also pre-Islam, pre-Christianity, pre-Judaism, we also have this whole thousands of years of time when goddess was worshipped and woman overall. And therefore, a lot of the imagery, a lot of the artifacts that we can find, statues, carvings in walls that are thousands of years old, are of the woman, the female reproductive system, women with animal heads, also the vulva, the shape of vagina, etc., entering a cave, seen as like this place you can heal or be reborn. And there was no issue around that. Men were to protect the woman, this mysterious, incredible creature that could create life, right? And typically also had their periods more together back in the more natural time. So, and revolving around 28 days, which was also the moon. So here's this mystical, magical creature that bears life and also lines up with a celestial body, with the moon, right? And her cycles. As well, the period itself, the bleeding, was seen as something also very magical. That was the magic time of woman. So very different also than how we see women today, too. So it related in that women in the matriarch were also the shamans and the musicians and the leaders and the doctors, medicine women. And they played this drum. And also we can see that a lot of the artifacts and carvings on the walls, thousands and thousands of years old in many parts of the world. So I'll discuss a little bit about this. So the language of the drum is basically two sounds, doom and tak, doom and tak. Now in a lot of traditions, doom is seen as the water sound or the feminine sound, and tak as more the masculine sound. In this case, fire. In many traditions, the tak is the sound to say, okay, spirits, God, we're ready, let's talk to you. And it sort of makes sense. It's kind of a loud, bright sound. Whereas the mother tone is there to sort of do the work, which is maybe the manifestation or the healing or blessing that you're performing. Now there's two more sounds to the drum. This is another considered feminine tone called earth tone. So we have water, fire, earth. And again, it makes sense. Mother Earth, there's sort of a grounding. And literally the hand is grounding, is holding the drum, supporting the drum, right? So, versus the water tone's more this, you feel the depth, the water. And the fire tone. And we have one more tone, which you can hear better on an animal skin drum, but it's a masculine tone, wind or air, where we rub the skin. But you can't hear that well. So these are the 4 tones of the frame drum, which each have meaning and affect in this work. Now, going back to the science of the brain and how it alights, and so it's still a mystery in the biological and the science world, but we believe that there are older parts of our brain that are involved when in theta state. Parts of the brain that we consider our centers when we do feel that spiritual enlightenment, or we feel the ecstasy or the tarab. We'll address those words, that topic soon. So what the ancients figured out, which is so fascinating, is that if you play the pulse 4 beats per second on the drum, you induce the theta state. So while conscious. And why is this useful? When you're asleep, you're less, you have less control per se to manifest things in your life, versus when you're conscious, you can have more control overall. So they would play this kind of pattern over and over, and with many drums and many shakers and things that represented sounds of nature. And it's still used to this day, and it's very, very profound and very accessible for youth and adults who've never experienced it before. And it's used today for meditation, if you will, for healing, for music therapy, therapeutic practices, which we can explore later together. I just want to move on to another topic, which is how now melody, how notes have also been a part of the world of spirituality and health and therapy.